President Bush has sent tens of thousands of America's best into the Middle East. They are there in full battle readiness. There are scores of U.S. naval vessels, hundreds of planes, and all of the modern military equipment anyone could imagine. Why have they been sent halfway around the world? President Bush said he committed these forces because of Iraq's aggression against tiny Kuwait. Should America's military forces be involved when one country invades another? The American people have been persuaded that our need for oil leaves us no choice but to be involved. Why then does our own government stand in the way of acquiring offshore oil near our coasts and known deposits of oil in Alaska? Why does this same government impede the use of coal and nuclear power that could make us far less dependent on foreign energy suppliers? An even more fundamental point to consider is, why do we have a military establishment in the first place? And the answer is that there are only two reasons for maintaining a military force. One is to protect U.S. territory, and the other is to protect U.S. citizens. If our nation, including any of our overseas territories, is attacked, our military should respond. And if and when Americans overseas are abused, such as being taken hostage, America's military should act swiftly and decisively, or every American will become a target. But no U.S. territory was threatened and no Americans were abused when the President ordered this massive deployment of troops. What's going on here? No President and no U.S. Congress is authorized to use our men and women in uniform as the world's policemen. President Bush worked hard to get United Nations approval for his speedy action. He claimed that the world community stands behind what he has done. But it's not the world community's troops in the desert sand. It's America's. There is something more going on here. Why the massive reaction to Iraq's takeover of Kuwait? There was no similar response to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, or the Kremlin's crackdown when Lithuania attempted to regain her independence. If oil is such a great concern, why did Mr. Bush ban oil and natural gas leasing in areas where both resources are known to be available? Why is he doing little or nothing about federal energy policies that have taken us from 29% dependence in 1973, at the height of the first energy crisis, to 50% dependence now? Why has he paved the way for the anti-American United Nations to take control of the operation? Did he learn nothing from the UN's previous involvement in directing the use of American military forces? History repeatedly confirms that war, even the threat of war, always brings with it more government and moral decline. War and the threat of war can also persuade a people to allow for drastic changes in their way of life, a loss of economic vitality, an erosion of national sovereignty, even a complete loss of freedom. Sometimes history shows that the freedoms lost by a people are not lost to some foreign enemy, but to unscrupulous leaders from within. William Shakespeare certainly had such a development in mind when he had one of his characters advise a power-seeking individual, "Be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels." Could such a tactic be in the minds of some powerful individuals in America? Let's answer that question by citing some important history. In 1952, members of the U.S. Congress had amassed a great deal of evidence showing that various tax-exempt organizations and foundations were involved in financing and promoting subversive activity within our nation. The U.S. House of Representatives formed an official committee to investigate this subversion. Its chairman appointed a knowledgeable and determined American named Norman Dodd as the committee's director of research. Late in 1953, at a meeting in New York City, Ford Foundation President H. Rowan Gaither bluntly told Norman Dodd that he and others had for years operated under directives issued by the White House, the substance of which was that we should make every effort to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union. Mr. Gaither added that he and others were still being guided by such directives. A startled Norman Dodd then asked Mr. Gaither if he would repeat what he had just stated before the full committee in Washington, and Gaither refused. And the plans to alter America in order to merge our nation with the USSR continued to unfold. This admission by the Ford Foundation's leader in 1953 was startling. But there were even more dramatic revelations uncovered by this committee before it was hounded out of existence in 1954. The John Birch Society has told this incredible story in our affiliated magazine, The New American, and in our videotape entitled Premeditated Merger. You are about to hear Norman Dodd's account of the uncovering of more subversion, this time perpetrated by a different foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Dodd will detail the shocking discoveries made by a committee lawyer named Catherine Casey. The interview you are about to see was conducted in 1982 by Mr. G. Edward Griffin. Mr. Dodd is now deceased.
She was on your staff. Let's start at that point, if you don't mind.
I selected this a lady on my staff by the name of Catherine Casey, who had been a practicing attorney in Washington, but who was on my staff having been put there politically in order to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or break any rules. She was a thoroughly competent, intelligent lady. And she came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, we are, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So it's, to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion, which is international, should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assembled 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. That's the story that ultimately grew out of, and of course was what could have been presented by the members of this congressional committee to the Congress as a whole for just exactly what it said. But they never got to that point.
This is the story that emerged from the minutes of the Carnegie Fund.
That's right.
The Carnegie Endowment
That's
Fund.
right.
And so...
It was official to that extent.
I see. And Catherine Casey brought all of these back in the form of dictated notes or verbatim readings of the minutes.
On dictaphone belts.
Are those in existence today?
I don't know. But if they are, they're somewhere in the archives under the control of the Congress, House of Representatives.
How many people actually heard those, or were they typed up transcripts made of them? How many people actually heard those recordings?
Oh, 3 maybe. Myself, my top assistants, and Catherine. Yeah, I might tell you this experience, as far as its impact on Catherine Casey was concerned, was she never was able to return to her law practice. If it hadn't been for Carol Reese's ability to tuck her away on a job with the Federal Trade Commission, I don't know what would have happened to Catherine, but ultimately she lost her mind as a result of it. Terrible shock.
Some of what you have just heard must seem unbelievable. Serious-minded men with great wealth at their disposal seeking to change America? A desire to involve our nation in war? And even to prolong the war in order to gain hidden objectives? These same men sought to control the State Department, and then American education, and then the teaching of history, altering it to promote what they called collectivism and what is more commonly known as socialism, the same goal of every communist who ever lived. Their overall goal was world government, run by them, and they have made frightening progress toward achieving it. The Congressional Committee also investigated the Council on Foreign Relations, a little-known private group headquartered in New York, whose members do dominate the State Department, and also the mass media, the military, the corporate world, and, as might be expected, the tax-exempt foundations. In its final report in 1954, the committee made note of the work of Catherine Casey, stating that the material she gathered shows clearly the interlock between the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and some of its associated organizations, such as the Council on Foreign Relations and other foundations, with the State Department. The committee said that the Council on Foreign Relations publications, quote, are directed overwhelmingly at promoting the globalistic concept, end quote, and that the organization had become, in essence, an agency of the U.S. government carrying its international bias with it. What's this got to do with 100,000 American military personnel in the Middle East in the 1990s? Plenty, as we intend to show. Members of the Council on Foreign Relations are directing this operation, as they have directed practically every step taken by our nation in the field of foreign affairs for better than 50 years. The CFR goal: one world socialism, world government, internationalism. Scrap the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. Constitution. Replace both with a world government charter. Pull down the stars and stripes and run up the United Nations flag instead. Merge our nation with communism in a one-world tyranny. This is what they want, and that's what many large foundations and groups like the Council on Foreign Relations have been working towards for most of the 20th century. Read the history of the Council on Foreign Relations in The Shadows of Power by James Perloff. Help those of us who are trying to keep our nation independent by spreading understanding about these globalists and their goals. In 1962, a Council on Foreign Relations member named Dr. Lincoln P. Bloomfield authored a study entitled A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. This study was financed by the State and Defense Departments, each headed at the time by a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In it, Dr. Bloomfield discussed why numerous U.S. officials had consistently aided world communism. That they had been supplying various kinds of aid to the USSR may come as a surprise to some Americans, but that they were doing so is beyond question. Dr. Bloomfield gave a reason for this treasonous activity as follows. If the communist dynamic was greatly abated, the West might lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Let's analyze that for a moment. U.S. officials were aiding world communism in order to keep it alive so that the threat it posed could force the West, especially the people of the United States, to want world government. It wasn't better red than dead, as bad as that would be. It was better world government than red. And if they hadn't been keeping communism alive, the incentive for world government would have been far less. These individuals and their organizations know that Americans will not easily give up U.S. sovereignty unless persuaded to do so by some terrible outside threat. So the threat of communism was created and maintained for that purpose. Over the years, foundation-funded groups have also promoted world government as the only recourse in the face of other real or imagined threats, such as nuclear weapons proliferation, environmental concerns, and population growth. Is the current crisis in the Middle East another threat that can be used to propel America into world government? It certainly is. Saddam Hussein in Iraq has given the advocates of world government a wonderful opportunity to push for the realization of their dream. Hussein marched into Kuwait. President Bush marched 100,000 American troops off to the Middle East. And if Americans aren't careful, their nation will be marched off into world government. President Bush served as a member of the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations as recently as 1979. He has maintained ties with this world government promoting organization all during his years as vice president and now as president. Today, there are 348 CFR members serving as U.S. government officials, yet there are only 2,556 individuals in this entire organization. Among the Council on Foreign Relations members directing this highly questionable use of U.S. military forces are Secretary of Defense Cheney, National Security Advisor Scowcroft, Deputy Secretary of State Eagleberger, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Powell. Federal policies have made America heavily dependent on foreign oil. We are now importing 50% of the oil we use, and that figure is expected to rise by another 3% each year. If we were not in this fix, our nation's response to Iraq invading Kuwait could have been, "It's awful that a tyrant is forcing his will on a small neighbor, but it's none of America's business, and we have no intention of getting involved." Even with our dependence on foreign oil, our response should have been the same. The only reason for sending troops into the area is to safeguard Americans, many of whom were taken as hostages after American troops arrived on Iraq's doorstep. President Bush seems determined at this point to let the United Nations dictate what our forces do, or to credit the United Nations for solving the problem he helped to make into the world's problem in the first place. The boost in prestige and importance for the world government under the UN has been tremendous. In addition, the economically strapped Soviet Union, still led by the criminals who raped Afghanistan and who continue to suppress millions yearning to be free, is now being considered a great ally by the Bush administration. Massive additional aid has been offered. The plans to alter the United States and comfortably merge our nation with the Soviets in a one-world tyranny ought to be obvious to all. Instead of boosting world government and involving the United States in a regional conflict, here are 4 steps that should be taken. 1. The U.S. should use our already deployed forces to obtain the prompt release of all Americans being held against their will in Iraq and Kuwait, and then bring the troops home. American blood should not be spilled to guarantee oil supplies for Japan and the nations of Western Europe, each of whom are far more dependent on Middle East oil than we are. American blood should also not be spilled for oil, even for America. 2. All American policy regarding this and any other crisis should be formulated and carried out in the interests of a sovereign United States of America without any requirement for approval by the United Nations, NATO, any other multinational group, or any other nation. 3. President Bush and the Congress must not be allowed to deflect attention away from their massive deficits with questionable muscle flexing in the Middle East. Rather than address the already serious debt problem, they are making it worse. 4. Truly honest efforts to make America energy independent should be undertaken promptly. Here are 5 recommendations for starters. Cancel President Bush's arbitrary 10-year ban on offshore oil and natural gas leasing. Open for development the locked-up mineral and energy treasures known to exist in Alaska. Remove many of the costly and unnecessary restrictions inhibiting the use of nuclear power. Abolish the Department of Energy that spends billions preventing energy production, and cancel plans to upgrade the Environmental Protection Agency to cabinet-level status, then abolish it and reestablish sensible concern for the environment at state and local level. The United States of America has been taken off course by powerful and wealthy influences who have been working throughout this century to build more government here at home and total government throughout the world. They don't intend to be limited by the U.S. Constitution, and they don't care a whit about the Declaration of Independence. Instead of a sovereign United States of America where government is limited by the Constitution, they have repeatedly led our country into a series of entangling alliances of the kind George Washington warned against in his farewell address. They have sent our armed forces into undeclared no-win wars under the control of a UN subsidiary, as in Vietnam, and under the United Nations itself in Korea. Our men never had a chance to win either of those wars, and many paid the supreme sacrifice. These powerful and wealthy influences seem determined to repeat this betrayal of our military and our country once again in this Mideast masquerade. These same individuals in and out of government have used great wealth to force fundamental changes in America. They have built the Soviet Union into a world power and have kept it afloat for decades, and they are still at it. Congress got wise to what they were doing in the 1950s and tried to stop them, but it was the congressmen who were stopped, and the subversion of America continued. The John Birch Society is determined to expose this monster conspiracy in order to keep our nation free and independent. All that is needed is sufficient exposure of the whole dirty business. Help us. Get involved. We look forward to hearing from men and women of good conscience and love of country throughout this great land. You and others simply must help in the campaign to keep us independent.